We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. At a press conference yesterday, Donald Trump said he would consider using military force to take Panama and Greenland and said all hell will break loose if Israeli hostages are not returned by the day he takes office. That would be January 20th, 2025. Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today we're talking with Eugene Puryear. Eugene is an author, he's an organizer, an activist. He's also the co-host of the Freedom Side Live that is on Breakthrough News every Thursday between 3 and 5 p.m. Eastern. Eugene, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's quite remarkable on the eve, almost the eve of Trump coming back to office, that he's taking office because 4 years ago, almost to this day, he was in disgrace. He was at the bottom. He seemed to be done for, politically finished, at least after the overrunning of the Congress by a mob inspired by him, many of whom were actually carrying weapons, led by fascist forces like the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys. Not everybody was a fascist, but there were certainly fascist forces. The U.S. military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a week later on January 12th, 2001, sent a letter to all 1.3 million members of the U.S. Armed Forces saying what happened on January 6th was sedition and insurrection and don't be involved in trying to overturn elections because it's against the law. Anyway, this was a moment of grave crisis for Donald Trump, and he's back. He didn't only win the Electoral College, he won the popular vote. Anyway, your take.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point. I mean, one way to look at it maybe is the co-chair, one of the co-chairs of Trump's presidential inaugural committee is Kelly Loeffler, who was a former senator of Georgia. She also has been nominated by him to head up the SBA. But people who can remember watching the drama over the Senate certification of the votes, she had really held herself out as a senator to be like 100% pro-Trump. And then as January 6th was unfolding, she changed her position subsequently and then became one of the important votes to actually certify the election. So someone who had turned on him almost completely, going with this tide that you have mentioned, is now actually back co-chairing his presidential inaugural committee. She's a billionaire. The pick just collects, the huge sums of money from billionaires and huge corporations. She may be the head of the Small Business Administration. And it's interesting because when you think about it also in the context of like Jamie Dimon a little bit towards the end of 2024, I think it was at the World Economic Forum, he was kind of defending Trump.
One of America's leading bankers.
The head of J.P. Morgan Chase, the most central bank, all these different pieces. He was kind of defending Trump. In 2016, you can remember the richest people were kind of trending a little bit more towards Hillary Clinton. Not that Trump didn't have a lot of rich supporters, but he was such a wild card, not the same. This past election, not that Kamala Harris didn't have a lot of rich supporters, but obviously the richest people in the country seemed a little bit more comfortable with Trump and putting out even more money than they had in 2020 or in 2016 to get him elected. And I think it says something about the United States that's notable because, Trump came in, he gave, a multi-trillion-dollar tax cut primarily to the wealthy. He got rid of every regulation that you could possibly imagine or tried to get rid of every regulation that was, crimping the profits in some way, shape, or form of corporations. He accelerated the attempt to kneecap China's economy and contain China, which of course started under Obama, so a bipartisan strategy. So I think for the people who really control politics in America, which is big business and wealthy individuals, I think most people know that, Trump was demystified. And maybe they don't like everything he does. Maybe they wish he was a little less coarse or a little less crass or, a little less this or that. But in the basic core, they can see that his policies, he's very committed to making sure they not only remain wealthy, but that they get even wealthier. And I think just like Jim Crow in the South, for instance, I think for a lot of the people who really run politics in the country, when it comes down to democracy is less important than their own pocketbook. And when they can see, hey, a guy like Trump is going to deliver the goods to my wallet, maybe he's not what I'd like to see, little anti-democratic, different things around the edges. that's okay, as long as we basically get what we need. And I think it's an important statement about whether or not we really live in a quote-unquote democracy as opposed to, a Republican oligarchy.
Yeah, and of course, democracy is a word that does not appear in the U.S. Constitution by intent, by the so-called founders.
Yes.
We're going to talk about the Trump
Elbridge Gerry, by the way, the guy who is gerrymandering is named after, actually said democracy was the worst form of government. So I'm sorry to do a little aside, but notable.
No. And even to the extent that the, quote, founding fathers wanted to talk about democracy at all, they wanted to have democratic elections for some people, including some people. Obviously, the masses of people could not vote. Obviously, enslaved people could not vote. Most white men without property could not vote until 1828. Women obviously couldn't vote. So their democracy was always a truncated form of democracy. Anyway, I want to talk to you about the real priorities and policies that we can expect from the incoming billionaire government. And it's literally a billionaire government. I mean, almost all of not all of them, but almost all of them are billionaires. There are 757 billionaires in the United States. They have $4.4 trillion worth of wealth. It's a new emerging phenomena in global capitalism that this concentration of wealth is so vast that this really tiny strata of capitalists, the billionaires, are really now literally running things. I want to talk about that. But I also want to talk to you about why the Democrats failed. I mean, real quickly, we don't have to spend much time on this, but I think it's important because there are going to be protests. You and I are involved in many of them on January 20th against the billionaire agenda of Trump, but it's not against Trump the person. There are others who are against Trump because he's not a Democrat. So let's just talk about the Democrats. Biden had the White House. He had the House of Representatives. He had the Senate in 2001. They could do whatever they want, presumably, right? They could. They were the dominant party, just as the Republicans are. During that time period, obviously, big parts of the population who voted Democratic in 2020 decided not to in 2024. That would be a message about the rule of the Democrats, not about Trump. The Democrats tried to make the election about Trump, but people said no, not because they love Trump, because they were disillusioned with the Democrats.
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, the Democrats come in, they have, basically total control of the government. And I think the thing is less what they did do, but what they didn't do. Although what they did do, or, maybe you can put them in the same category, is relevant. But you can remember coming into the new Democratic administration in 2020, there was the whole issue around the runoff election in Georgia around the Senate. And the big thing became the $1,200 checks. And of course, during the COVID crisis, because of necessity, almost all of us received a relatively significant sum of money from the government to help us deal with our costs and all our different challenges. Many people felt that this was still very relevant given the economic devastation that was still with us, the overhang from the lockdowns and everything like that. So they think that the Democrats are going to come in, they're going to have control of the Senate, they already have control of the House, they have the presidency, we're going to get these $1,200 checks. We did not get the $1,200 checks. And then, of course, the Democrats say, but we are going to continue a number of other programs that you did like the child tax credit, which had, I think, halved child poverty, but it had reduced it very significantly.
Almost in a year.
And you had a number of other programs that were sort of, doing various different things, proposing to also expand the care economy so there'd be more access to child care, health care, so on and so forth. A lot of that gets folded into the Build Back Better plan, and it immediately gets stripped out in the negotiations over the Build Back Better plan. It's some of the first stuff that gets stripped out, and the Biden administration didn't even really fight for it. I mean, one of the things that's worth remembering if you think about Build Back Better is when the initial just completely absurd opposition was coming from within the Democratic Party, primarily Joe Manchin. Kamala Harris goes on the radio in West Virginia and says, what Joe Manchin is telling West Virginians is a lie. Like, this bill is going to benefit you really significantly. In West Virginia, very poor state, a lot of challenges, the opioid crisis. And, she's just ticking off all the things that would actually help people, some of which were carryovers from the COVID bills, some of which would be new programs that would expand different elements of social programs. And then Joe Manchin complained. And instead of just, saying, okay, who cares? We're going to campaign and try to win. Biden apologized and said that he would never do anything like that again. So you have the promises that were made that were not kept. Then you have the things that were just not enacted that, I think maybe everyone knows in elections not everything is going to happen, and maybe wouldn't have expected everything to be passed, but to see almost no push whatsoever, and then you have the overhang of what happens there. Child poverty goes back up again. And then you have the context of the inflation crisis, which heavily accelerates in 2021 and 2022, and all of these other programs like cheaper childcare, better access to long-term care for senior citizens, all these things that maybe could have cushioned people a little bit by having more robust social programs that would have kept them. Medicaid winding down, millions and millions of people kicked off of Medicaid over the course of almost most of the second half of the Biden administration. So in addition to not doing anything about inflation, and they did nothing about inflation, they just said, oh, that sounds so bad, but they really did nothing to stop it. They also did not enact the policies that could have cushioned it, making the issue even worse. So I think for a lot of people, I think it was 5-ish million people who voted for Biden who didn't show up for Kamala Harris. That, I think, is the core reality of what happened. It's not that they loved Trump, but they felt like we cannot actually trust the Democrats to deliver on the core issues that we care about because we gave them the whole government in 2020, and they didn't even really moderately deliver. And then when we faced this new inflation crisis, they were just sort of arms crossed. The economy's great. If you don't understand the economy's great, you must be an idiot.
Yeah. Medicaid, people, this is one of the problems I think in America is in terms of the formation of class consciousness, which as socialists we think is, preeminently important for working class people to see society divided into classes and to fight for our class. People think of themselves as an auto worker, a textile worker, a transit worker. They don't think of themselves as part of the working class in conflict with the ruling class. But if you're not on Medicaid, you don't think about Medicaid. If you're not on Social Security, you don't think about Social Security. So there's this compartmentalization of the working class. So our own identity informs our consciousness or people's consciousness. So if you're not on Medicaid, you don't think, oh, well, what does that matter? You might not even think about it. You might not know what Medicaid even is. Well, Medicaid was for the poorest of the poor who couldn't afford doctor's care. But under COVID, as you're pointing out, Medicaid was expanded. And 25 million people in the United States lost Medicaid under the Biden administration. Now, who were those 25 million? Not the poorest of the poor. It was the people who are now expanded. COVID gave expanded Medicaid coverage. So there was the next income layer up that got access to health care coverage. So if you have that part of the population, working class, people who basically have jobs, basically not the poorest of the poor, but dependent on Medicaid to be able to go to the doctor, and those people lose health care, and those 25 million people, you can see why that by itself could tip the elections. This is, again, people who don't have kids. You might not think, well, what does a $300 a month tax credit mean? Well, it could mean the difference between whether you can ever go out to eat or whether you're barely making ends meet or not making ends meet.
No, I think it's a great point. I mean, it's one of these things that I think, like you said, if you're not on it, you're not really thinking about it. And I think this has always been one of the key factors of healthcare in America. I mean, of course, you can remember in the Bush administration, the donut hole debate. You can remember the issue that was raised by the Tea Party of people who were in between the subsidies and the ability to get on something like Medicaid, who were paying outlandish rates of insurance. Not that the Tea Party was really addressing it, but at least was bringing it to our consciousness. It's like the healthcare system in America, like the Swiss cheese of who's included and who's not. And it's like, unless you're rich, there's a chance that there's some element of your healthcare that's going to be suboptimal or subpar on some level if you have access at all. Now, of course, because of the ACA, it's increased the possibility of more people having access. But I think this is also important about the Medicaid debate, because I'm sure there's some people who say, well, some of those people will be able to get access to the exchanges. But I want people to remember back to the debate in the 2020 Democratic primary, where everyone was saying, Bernie Sanders is saying we should have universal healthcare, and it's going to be so expensive. And then there was the study that came out that the Washington Post put out in the article, even though they also attacked Bernie Sanders for this amazingly, that said it'll actually be more expensive to provision healthcare, like just what the government expends, taxes, everything is going to be more expensive to provision healthcare in our current private Swiss cheese system than universal health care. And it makes sense because private health care is for profit, so it's not very efficient. So pushing people off of Medicaid, even if they get health care on the exchanges, is actually still eroding the quality of health care in America because it's just a subsidy for the huge insurance companies, and they're totally ridiculous, as we just saw with people's anger with United Healthcare. They're a completely ridiculous way that of providing health care that means that even though the U.S. spends the most, we have the worst health outcomes of almost any industrialized country. So in addition to people losing health care, getting lower quality health care, it's also furthering the privatization of our healthcare system in a way that makes our healthcare not really efficient. It makes it not healthcare, but sick care. And it's not that Medicaid doesn't need a lot of improvements, which it does, but to have publicly provisioned universal healthcare that is well funded and organized is in fact critically important for us to be at our healthiest. It's not just about insurance per se, but also how healthcare is provisioned to us. And I think that's a sort of hidden part of this that not a lot of people are talking about, that the Biden administration facilitating this wind down is doing, is just perpetuating the situation that gives us sick care, not health care.
Yeah, it's really so important. And most European capitalist countries, the advanced capitalist countries, so to speak, they have a way different healthcare system. I mean, when you think about the fact that when people are available for Medicare, when you're older, for instance, it doesn't cover dental, it doesn't cover vision, it doesn't cover hearing. Like your ears don't get better when you're older, your teeth don't get better with age, your eyes don't get better, and yet those things are not covered. I mean, when you think about the assassination of the United Healthcare executive here on the streets of Manhattan, and so many people didn't sympathize with him or his family, but with all of the people who have been victimized by United Healthcare, which is denying and delaying payment so that when people are most vulnerable, the failure to come up with payment actually destroys their lives. That's why it's not because people are bloodthirsty. They're like angry. They're angry. And again, this was the Democratic Party system. Anyway, I want to turn now to I want to go to Trump.
Yeah.
We have a clip here. It's Donald Trump at a press conference. He gave an hour-long press conference at Mar-a-Lago. He's back. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump is back. So the media and maybe society finds it somewhat recreational. I mean, He was a professional showman.
Definitely.
He's a byproduct of reality TV.
And wrestling.
And you can see in his cabinet wrestling billionaires. Well, they don't wrestle, but they make billions from other
made all the money,
people. Yeah. Anyway, let's listen to this clip. Trump seems to be preoccupied with Greenland. Let's listen.
Well, we need Greenland for national security purposes. I've been told that for a long time, long before I even ran. I mean, people have been talking about it for a long time. You have approximately 45,000 people there. People really don't even know if Denmark has any legal right to it. But if they do, they should give it up because we need it for national security. That's for the free world. I'm talking about protecting the free world. You don't even need binoculars. You look outside, you have China ships all over the place. You have Russian ships all over the place. We're not letting that happen. We're not letting it happen. And if Denmark wants to...
Trump is preoccupied with Greenland. It started in 2019.
Yeah.
At that time, it was considered kind of a joke. Mm-hmm. I actually don't think he's joking. One only need to look at a map of Greenland. It's a sparsely populated, very large island, but it's in the Arctic. Global warming is such that, that whole part of the Arctic is opening up for mineral exploration, for energy exploration, and it really will become the next battlefield. Mm-hmm. I mean, all of the major powers are thinking about the Arctic. Greenland right now is part of Denmark, has been for a long time. Maybe there will be independence. There isn't, quote, independence movement in Greenland, even though it's a sparsely populated area. But Trump did not rule out using military force against Panama to take Panama Canal back and Greenland. Well, let's think about it. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803, France sold this big part of North America to the United States, even though France isn't France and this was North America. It was a paltry number, I think $15 million. The U.S. bought Alaska from Russia Hawaii was not purchased. That was just seized by military means. Same with a big part of Mexico, half of Mexico, also now known as California, Texas, etc. Anyway, it seems outlandish, but I want to get your take. Again, it's become less of a joke and more perhaps of a real policy thing.
Yeah, and I mean, he sent his son and several people who he called his representatives to Greenland recently. So I think it seems outlandish because I think people would like to think that the era of like territorial expansion by imperial powers is over since we're in an era of sort of the post-colonial, neo-colonial era. But I think it actually is 100% logical. And it speaks to my earlier point when we opened the show about how comfortable the richest people in the world or in the United States are with Trump over time. Because when you look at the overall broader policy of the ruling class, the bipartisan policies, the real center and core of U.S. imperial policy is to contain and to kneecap China's economy. They view China not only as the main rival to the United States, but the facilitator of all the other possibilities. Like if Europe is going to become more independent from the United States, they would have to work with China. India, if they were to break with the U.S. consensus and work with China, could really vastly shift the global power structure away from the global north. ASEAN, same thing. Africa, same thing. So it's like China specifically, and also, of course, China has a lot of trade with the United States. So the more powerful China becomes, the less the United States can do whatever they want to do. So from the ruling class of the United States that wants to be able to do whatever they want to do, they know they have to kneecap and contain China. But that actually has repercussions. So when you look at Greenland, for instance, has rare earth minerals. Now, China is one of the largest producer of rare earth minerals. That's why you see many of the Chinese responses to U.S. Sanctions on Chinese companies is to restrict the export of rare earth minerals, which are critical for a 21st century economy. Greenland also has lithium, which is also central for a 21st century economy. And many of the lithium deposits around the world, Chinese companies have been ahead of American companies. And so from just that one perspective, you can see that it makes sense if you're saying we're going to be going into a conflict, maybe even a war with China, that we want to make sure that we can secure the minerals we need to keep our country going more securely than they are now. Now, of course, they're already relatively secure. I mean, Greenland is a part of Denmark. Denmark is a member of NATO. It's a very, very close ally of the United States. Denmark, the Scandinavian countries, it's not talked about a lot here, but very close ally, very close relationship. NORAD, which is the sort of the nuclear umbrella over the United States, so-called defense, right? But like the sort of Cold War architecture for nuclear war with Russia. Big base, Tool Air Force Base, which is in Greenland. So, I mean, even the idea that Greenland is like super independent from America is a little bit ridiculous. And when we see what's happening in Ukraine and how the European countries are following behind America, I don't think that there will be any problem getting lithium or rare earth minerals from Greenland, especially as the ice sheet starts to retreat. But nonetheless, you can see the logic of it in that perspective. And of course, you just add on over the top of that, this is one of the most critical areas for Russian ships and submarines to come through the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. So insofar as Russia is still a major power that even if Trump might want to have better relations with, you still got to watch them. That area is also critically important. So from the point of view of the ruling class of America that's sharpening its fangs to confront and contain China, maybe even have a war with them, to confront and contain Russia, already in a proxy war with them, to maintain critical control over the minerals you need in a 21st century economy, there's a logic to what Trump is saying that even though it sounds kind of fantastical and crass, I think is actually deeply rooted in the economic realities of the American capitalist class and what they see their future being over the next, let's say, 20 or so years.
No, I think those are really important points. And again, our consciousness in the 21st century is it seems crazy that there will be territorial expansion and by one power seizing the country, the territory of another country. And in fact, the U.S. has sort of used this as a playbook to condemn Russia for moving into the eastern part of Ukraine, which is the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine. At the time that Russia felt threatened by NATO expansion in Ukraine, the U.S. said, "How can you change the borders in Europe?" Well, the borders have been changed multiple times. The Soviet Union's borders were changed. Yugoslavia was destroyed by NATO, and its borders were changed. But the idea of changing borders was existential to an earlier era of imperialist development, the emergence of imperialism. Of course, European settlers conquered North America. Of course, there was the conference in Berlin in 1884 and 1885, where the European countries divided up Africa. And by 1902, except for Ethiopia, all African self-governance was gone. Those borders, the borders we see now, the ones that the Organization of African Unity says they don't want to disrupt, those are European-imposed borders. So again, it's not that actually rare. It was actually very common in an earlier era. So maybe we're coming full circle now. Let's go to Panama. Mm-hmm. The U.S. Seized Cuba and Puerto Rico and Guam in order to build a Panama Canal to link the northeast industrial cities of the United States to the Pacific in order to conquer Asia, certainly to play ball in China, in Asia and China. The U.S. seized the Philippines at the same time in order to create an American colony that would be sort of a stepping stone as this trans-oceanic trade developed. Now, I want to play another clip. Trump is saying, we're going to take the Panama Canal back. As you just pointed out about Greenland, it doesn't matter that Panama's government is actually friendly to America. It's a neoliberal government. It's not a radical government. It's not Noriega or Torrijos from the earlier era. It's not Fidel. But it doesn't matter. In a way, the U.S. wants to secure this because they don't. I think the U.S., or Trump now being the most sort of upfront voice about it, doesn't want that government to have an alternative to trade with China. Anyway, let's listen to Trump, and it's really quite remarkable.
Are not followed, then we will demand that the Panama Canal be returned to the United States of America in full, quickly, and without question. I'm not going to stand for it. So to the officials of Panama, please be guided accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of cowboy imperialism, right? Like, we're going to take it with swagger, also this whining like Panama is hurting the United States. I mean, all of that kind of BS from Trump. He's just this big whiner. We're treated unfairly. I'm treated unfairly. We're victims. I'm a victim. The country's a victim. But I'm going to set the record straight. Eugene, if the United States had not signed the Panama Canal Treaty, which Jimmy Carter did, thus allowing Panama to take control of the canal by 1999, the U.S. had predicted that there would be guerrilla armed struggle in Panama, as there was in Nicaragua, as there was in El Salvador. That treaty was not a gift to the Panamanians. American imperialism was afraid of the armed struggle of the Panamanian people.
No, I think so for sure. And I mean, you look at what was happening around the world in the 1970s and just the 4 or 5 years before, you could see that the idea of taking back the sovereignty over your national resources was driving, as you said, and also just generally sovereignty against neocolonialism. Nicaragua, obviously the war in El Salvador, the Iranian Revolution. I mean, this was a sentiment that all around the world people were doing it. So it makes sense. And I think it also has to be put in the same context as Greenland. I mean, already the Panama Canal has a lot of problems, the prime one being climate change and affecting the issue of the water in there. But obviously Panama is a country that's a big commercial hub because of the Panama Canal. And I think the idea that you have an independent country, friendly or not, they're friendly today. What if they're not friendly tomorrow? What if they decide they want to work with this country or that country or whatever it may be? The U.S. could be in significant trouble. And I think we have to put it also in the context of the overall sort of quote-unquote pink tide movement in Latin America that's been restoring sovereignty and pushing back the edges of neocolonialism in Mexico and Colombia. Because when I make the point about how the Panama Canal is already having problems, especially from the point of view of climate change, you can see Mexico has already developed this port and train system to transfer things off the ship onto a train in the Pacific, across the country of Mexico.
So they've built a railroad from the Atlantic to the Pacific.
Yes, and they've built huge ports that actually make it really easy to take the stuff right off the ship, right onto a train, all these different things. This is a big project of AMLO. And so that in and of itself is guaranteed to take business away from the Panama Canal because it's basically just as fast, I think in some cases faster, and it's not dependent on the water level and climate change to the same degree. There's also discussion about a similar sort of rail in Colombia that would also bypass the Panama Canal. Now, what are the things we know about Mexico and Colombia? Many contradictions, many things we could say about both governments. But the one thing we know for sure is the fourth transformation governments in Mexico are taking back Mexican sovereignty vis-a-vis the United States significantly, trying to expand economic growth. So that's also an important trade route that America could probably, I think, guess they won't be able to fully control, especially because Mexico has a big leverage leverage over even Trump, as we saw during AMLO, which is the issue of immigration. Colombia, similar thing. You've had the traditional Arabista, right-wing forces displaced by Gustavo Petro's government, also trying to produce more economic growth for its own people. Oil is a big thing in Colombia, trying to move away from that. So having big trade and more things like that come through. So I think you could also surmise, if you're Trump or his advisors, you might not be able to fully control that. So the U.S. thinking, okay, well, wait a second, we're going to massively increase our military presence abroad. Trump is talking about we're going to go after China, we're going to go after this country, we're sanctioning this country, we're doing this, we're doing that. And our three main areas for getting goods from the Pacific to the Atlantic might actually not be fully under our control. That's a big Achilles heel when we don't know who we're going to be upsetting, how we're going to be upsetting them, or what their response is going to be. And if one of them is China, which has a lot of economic resources, they might be able to really mess things up for us. And you can also add that Nicaragua has been proposing for many years this idea of a new canal there. So I think in terms of having the Panama Canal, Trump is thinking, and those around him are thinking, whatever the challenge of the canal, at least we would have one place in terms of this critical commercial choke point that we controlled so that it would no longer be a choke point in the reality of a changing world in terms of how Pacific to Atlantic commerce is happening.
Let's just talk about this again, and I want to emphasize before we move on to the next point, I want to move on to the Gulf of Mexico, which Trump wants to rename the Gulf of America. But I want to talk a little bit more about the issue of the rise of China, because I think, it's discussed a lot, but I think kind of superficially and sort of not in a historical setting. And I think in terms of Latin America, this is really important. The U.S. adopted the so-called Monroe Doctrine in the first half of the 19th century. And the Monroe Doctrine was basically a statement saying, European colonists, we the American bourgeoisie, we the American capitalist class, we're going to dominate Latin America. Your era of domination of Latin America, Spain, Portugal, and Britain especially, that's over, or it's going to unwind. It's going to wind down, and you don't come back. So basically, the Monroe Doctrine was pointed at European colonizers, saying, we are the new colonizers. We're the new sheriff in town. Latin America belongs to us. Now, obviously, that has changed a lot during the period of anti-colonialization, post-World War II, the Cuban Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. But China has emerged as a trading partner with the Latin American countries, the Asia-Pacific Economic Organization. Those countries have a Pacific coast. China has a Pacific coast. The Chinese and Latin American trade is growing exponentially. Yes, the U.S. could invade Panama as it did in 1989. They disbanded the Panamanian Army, by the way, by 1991, so Panama doesn't have an army, just like, hey, Panama, you're not going to have an army anymore. But nonetheless, China's economic capacity. Karl Marx talked about how China could be penetrated by cheap commodities in the 19th century. He said the Great Wall will be, violated by not military force, but by cheap commodities. Well, now, in reverse, China's trade with Latin America means Latin America can be actually economically independent of the U.S.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. I mean, just look at Bahia in Brazil, where Ford closed down a factory and it just was reopened as a BYD factory, and that's one of the poorer states, majority black
BYD,
states.
BYD, a
Chinese electric vehicle company. So you can see facilitating economic growth in the core base of President Lula's government, which Bahia is one of their core base areas for the PT. It's being facilitated by China, not the United States. The United States is leaving from a lot of these different areas, and it's not as if there's not a lot of trade that exists between them, but the reality is the primary commodities that many of these countries produce are actually, the market is really China, not the United States, especially agriculture. I mean, the U.S. is one of the biggest agricultural powerhouses on the planet. So not that we don't import a lot of food, but there is no huge market for Brazilian and Argentinian beef and soy and wheat and all of that in America. It's in China. The same thing is true of bananas in Ecuador and many different places. So, you can even look, and also even the primary materials that are coming into the industries where the primary manufacturer, the secondary manufacturing is primarily happening in China. So you send the raw materials to China as opposed to the way you used to send them to the United States, because the U.S. isn't coming into a later element of the supply chain. So for these countries to increase their economic growth, increase growth with China China is essentially required. I mean, it's the main market for a lot of the things that they can sell, and it's the main source of investment for many of the sort of basic expanding industries that are existing, inside of the world now, electric vehicles, different things like that. Since China is trying to expand into all these places, they're willing to invest and bring in these other pieces. So I think it is a challenge to the Monroe Doctrine. We see what just happened with Peru, the big port that they built there that was announced, I think, at the APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Conference, I think it is, community, whatever it is, conference that it was announced. President Xi was there, is obviously a huge deal. So you can see that the sort of Monroe Doctrine era, I mean, even Mexico is doing a huge amount of trade with China. Now, the irony of that is a lot of the Mexican trade with China is because the U.S. attempts to restrict trade with China. So Chinese companies are going to Mexico to get around the restrictions and come in. But nonetheless, you can see that it obviously has played a big role in the expansion of the Mexican economy. And this is actually something that is being heavily discussed there about making Mexico more of a site for this kind of I think you could really call it kind of sanctions avoiding investment that could, continue to push their economy forward. So you can see that Latin America-China connection is deep and important, but it also is related to the United States as well. And it shows how, in my view, the policies of trying to stop China's rise, even though you don't always see it on the front end, because of the way the supply chain is totally globalized, is really coming back to bite Americans by increasing the cost of goods and all these other different things that we don't really hear about or know about or the media doesn't talk about, but are the knock-on effects of a lot of these policies.
All right, let's talk about the Gulf of Mexico. Now, one of the things about the post-colonial world, let's say 1945 on, when the anti-colonial revolution became in all continents that are dominated by the imperialists, like preeminent. There was working class-led liberation movements, there were communist-led, there were also bourgeois-led, all kinds of different political forms of leadership, but they were all fighting essentially for the same thing: freedom, independence, sovereignty. And as a consequence, the imperialists had to change the way they talked. They had to show respect. They had to at least feign respect. In other words, it wasn't like the 19th century where the European colonialists could just speak in openly racist terms. That was no longer acceptable. One of the things about Trump in American politics, and I think internationally, is he's going back to that earlier era where he doesn't care about the words. Like, no matter how insulting the words are, Trump doesn't care. That's part of Make America Great Again, is like to go back to the language, the vocabulary of straight out brazen imperialism and racism. With that said, let's listen to this clip about the Gulf of Mexico.
And we're going to be announcing at a future date pretty soon. We're going to change, because we do most of the work there and it's ours. We're going to be changing sort of the opposite of Biden, where he's closing everything up, essentially getting rid of $50 to $60 trillion worth of assets.
You can see, in some ways, you can make a joke about it. It seems so ludicrous. The way we were making a joke out of Greenland in 2019. But, Trump represents this vocalized chauvinism, racism, sort of cowboy Yankee colonialism, and the ability of society to accommodate words matters. Like, when people can use certain words or are forbidden from using certain words, it has an impact on consciousness. This is straight out national chauvinism. I think this is going to rub Latin America the wrong way. I think it's going to, Mexico is an independent country, had a great revolution, has always been independent. And at the same time, Panama is a unifier for Latin America. This seems gratuitous in some ways, meaning unnecessary. But this is Trump. This is Make America Great Again, meaning going back to this kind of 19th century language.
No, I think you're right. And I think Trump's attitude is, you might not like it. What are you going to do about it? It reminds me of that famous Dave Chappelle skit, he's pretending to be the president and someone asked him about the UN sanctioning him. And he's like, and with what army? Does UN have an army? And it was a joke, but it's true. And just look at how the European leaders have essentially, they've cut their own throat and their own wrist and are bleeding out on their bathroom floor economically to go with a plan that is basically only, and you could argue it's not really benefiting the United States, but if you look at the war in Ukraine, it's obviously destroying Europe. The United States, especially certain industries, are kind of getting over it. And it was obviously a U.S. plan from the beginning to lure Russia into this space. So if Europe, which is like the next most powerful part of the world, can't offer even the most sort of token opposition to the United States, well, I mean, hey, why not press your advantage on every single front with other countries that have significantly less power, influence? Like Europe is the largest foreign investor in America. Like they don't have a huge army to like challenge America, but they certainly have a lot of economic levers they could pull that could hurt the United States. That's for sure. You look at Denmark. Wegovy, that weight loss drug, that's from Denmark. So they start pulling stuff, it could really affect the lives of Americans in a big way, in a way that people would not like, right? But so even that, they're not standing up. So I think that's sort of the Trump sort of, and if you think about who Trump models himself after, well, Teddy Roosevelt, right? Like that was sort of his sort of idea, which is to use this sort of brazen, militaristic, bully boy, kind of attitude to kind of push people into things. Andrew Jackson, who is Trump's, he says it was his favorite president, who, sort of brash, out of the norm kind of behavior is the normal piece. And both of those presidents are, of course, associated with significant imperial expansion of the United States. Jackson, of course, inside this country with the expansion, the genocide of Native Americans, and Roosevelt in terms of the expansion in the early imperial era of the first part of the 20th century. So I think Trump is modeling his behavior off of his heroes and recognizing, as they did, that the United States had enough power, vis-a-vis their enemies at that time, that no one could really stop them. Now, will that be the case? Who knows? And I think a lot of times people with a lot of bluster, that's the Icarus story, right? You end up falling from the sky when the wax on your wings melts. And I think Trump in and of himself, definitely has a tendency to overreach. And some of this stuff, I think, as you're saying, which is gratuitous, could end up backfiring. But I can understand why he's doing it, because it does look on an international scale that whether you're facilitating a genocide in Gaza, whatever you're doing, that no one is really gonna stop you. So why not just tell them openly to their face?
Yeah. Well, let's play another clip. This is Trump. Again, he's talking at Mar-a-Lago. We're hearing a lot about how he's, it's the sequel. It's Trump 2. This is him talking about Palestine. All hell will break loose unless the Israeli hostages are not given back to Israel by January 20th. Anyway, I want to ask you about this, but let's listen to the clip.
If those hostages aren't back, I don't want to hurt your negotiation. If they're not back by the time I get into office, all hell will break out in the Middle East. Can you elaborate? And it will not be good for Hamas. And it will not be good, frankly, for anyone. All hell will break out.
Eugene, all hell already has broken out. I mean, it's hell. Right now, people are freezing to death. Babies are freezing to death. And Lebanon fought back with the Palestinians. Yemen fought back with the Palestinians. Iran, of course, did some. The Chinese hosted the Palestinian parties and factions so that, they could try to forge a unity. In Cuba, there was protests, island-wide protests in support of Palestine, Venezuela. But in general, the world watched as the genocide, paid for by the U.S., armed by the U.S., and now Trump is coming in, all hell will break loose. Now, there's some talk that Trump is trying to get a ceasefire agreement before he comes in. But again, Biden unleashed a hell on the Palestinians, but they never said it's going to be hell. Mm-hmm. They used different words. Anyway, I want to get your thoughts. The other day in my show, I called 2024 a long year, the way Gerald Horne talked about the 16th century as a long century in the apocalypse, because it really started in 1492 when Columbus set sail, but that was the dominant shaping. Well, 2024 was really shaped by the events of October 7th and the follow-up genocide. Anyway, just your thoughts on this before we go out. Before we go to other topics.
Yeah, I think as you say, it's already a hell. Like, how could it possibly get any worse? I guess maybe I could try to find some way to think of it. But, honestly, it reminds me, and I'm only laughing because it's so ridiculous of how all of that, so many of these really aggressive Kamala Harris supporters like, well, if Trump gets in, it's going to get even worse. How can it possibly get worse? They're deliberately starving people. The only sort of bombing campaign or war that I think could even be considered roughly comparable to this is maybe the Korean War, which was so genocidal and never talked about. I mean, it's almost unprecedented what they're doing in Gaza. Plus, you have what they're doing in the West Bank. Plus, you have what they're doing in the surrounding countries. But I don't think it can really get any worse. But I do think it speaks to a number of different things. I mean, one, the extreme callousness of the U.S. ruling imperial elite, that whether they say it openly or whether they don't say it openly, that they could actually do something like this. I mean, really, to be capable of something like this, when we think about the Holocaust, the other German genocide against the Herero people in Namibia, what was done against the Native Americans in the United States, I think most people think, yeah, you got to be pretty effed up to do that. And now, almost every politician in America in both parties is 100% for a historically comparable event. And that also is why, to some degree, I actually do think it's mainly a negotiating tactic, because I just don't see how they could really do that much more. Now, they could continue what they are doing, and they could be more open about, yes, they are starving them out. Now Blinken is trying to pretend like they're not starving them out, saying, well, they did get this number of trucks in. Well, some food was getting into the Warsaw Ghetto too, but obviously they were trying to starve them out. You know what I mean? It's just these ridiculous semantics that are being played. So I think Trump really is indicating here that we're just going to be more open about what we're already doing. So if you want it to stop, you should probably come to some sort of agreement, because don't wait on me to stop it. But I think the idea that somehow this is qualitatively worse than what Biden facilitated, I think is a dangerous form of revisionist history.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think you can get worse than what Biden has done. I mean, when you think about it, 2%, more than 2% of the population in Gaza is dead. Most of them are kids and their moms. 100,000, 150,000 are wounded. So if you had 2% of the U.S. population killed in the last 15 months, we're a country of 340 million. That would be 6.8 million dead. That's what 2% of 340 million is.
And just to give people a sense of scale, that would be orders of magnitude more than the number of Americans who died in any war. Both numerically and proportionally, the Civil War is the most people died. It was 600,000 people then, but that would not be that now. I don't know exactly what it would be.
Yeah, and it's not, and beyond the dead, there's no hospitals left.
Yeah.
There's no universities left.
Yeah.
The housing is destroyed. So it would be 6.8 million dead in 15 months, and all of our cities destroyed. Anyway, I want to keep going here, because I do want to talk to you as we continue about what we think is coming in terms of Trump's economic policies, his social policies. He's promising mass deportations. In other words, there's quite a bit to talk about. I do want to, and we'll come back at the very end and talk about foreign policy again. I want to talk about Ukraine and China a little bit more and get your opinion on something. This is a billionaire cabinet. Now, Trump said during the campaign about Project 2025, a 900-page document circulated by the Heritage Foundation for a major restructuring of American governance. He said, I don't know who those people are. Well, he did know who they were. Yeah. They were his people. But now Russell Vought, who was the director of Project 2025, will become the director of Office of Management and Budget. I want to talk to you about that. Then afterwards, I want to talk about Department of Government Efficiency, Elon Musk. I also want to ask you, or you can jump in with this. These guys are all from South Africa. I mean, they're not only billionaires, but a whole bunch of them, at least 4 of them, are white South African men who are involved in mining and other sort of profiteering from the fascist apartheid system. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's the South Africa connection. We're going to maybe do a whole other show on that. I mean, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel also is from there. I mean, even
David Sachs.
David Sachs is from there. Even when you look at, so South Africa, the right wing in America has been saying they were going to sanction South Africa majorly because South Africa is, trades heavily with China, has good relations with Russia. So even to get to Trump, the ANC government. So Trump was playing golf with Ernie Els, who then calls Oppenheimer, one of the richest white mining, like neo-settler colonial people in South Africa. And it's like, Oppenheimer wants to talk to you. He's talking to Trump and basically telling him like, yo, you can't sanction South Africa because this is not black people's money. Y'all think it's black people's money. This is actually like our money. And hold on, I'm going to like conference in President Ramaphosa so he can talk to you. So you can see the connection and the relationship. And it is an important statement in all seriousness about the critical role that South Africa plays in Anglo-American wealth and that it has since its beginning. But that's sort of a whole separate issue. Raising Project 2025. Yeah, amazing that Trump didn't know who any of these people were. And now tons of them have been appointed to all these different positions. And obviously you mentioned OMB as one of the main ones, which makes sense. Like OMB is kind of like a beehive at the center of the government, right? Like if you think about just the name, Office of Management and Budget, there you go. It deals with a lot of the sort of management issues of like how the government is actually going to work. And then it deals with the related issue, right? Which is the budget, which is what is the White House going to prepare as its proposal for what the government should be spending on all of these different pieces. So thinking about what the government should be spending and how it's going to spend it and coming up with plans that sort of speak to this different piece. Now, of course, they're doing it in, conjunction and collaboration with all the different government departments, but it's sort of like a nerve center inside the White House of how do you coordinate all these different pieces of a pretty big government that has a lot of moving parts. And also then if you want to get rid of parts of it, if you want to make major changes to parts of it in terms of the budget, which is essentially how you get rid of and make major changes to departments. So the fact that the sort of coordinator of this effort that was housed in the Heritage Foundation, but had over 100 organizations. And if you look at the new head
We're
of
doing
the
Project 2025. Yep.
You look at Kevin Roberts, who's the head of the Heritage Foundation. He said the whole goal of what he's trying to do is to reunify the right wing because there's been all these rifts between the Trump people, the Cheney people, these other people. So he wants to try to find a way to take the Trump phenomenon, but keep the sort of core element of the Republican agenda as the Heritage Foundation sees it, which is hyper-capitalism and making the richest people fabulously wealthy, no matter what the repercussions are to anyone else in the country. And that Project 2025 is a blueprint for how to build a political majority that keeps that political core of doing everything only for the wealthy, no matter what, like intact, right? So now you've got the guy who coordinated that project at sort of the nerve center of how you would coordinate carrying something like that out.
Let me jump in and then go right back to you. That budget for the people watching this show, the federal budget is $6.75 trillion, not million, not billion, $1 trillion. So this is the vastest pile of money. So this guy, who was the author of Project 2025, is at the center of how that money is going to be spent. That's the Office of Management and Budget, OMB.
Yes, no, I think that's right. He's the center of it in relationship with the House Ways and Means Committee, which is really the center. And some of that is interesting about the relationship between how big business really controls the government by pitting these different entities against each other. But it's critically important because it actually just suggests that despite Trump saying that he doesn't know anything about it, that they are going to immediately pursue as much as they possibly can of what's in Project 2025, because why would they not? I mean, when you think about how the guy even assembled the experts, he went and tried to get the people he thought were the best people on the right on all these issues who had experience in government, experience in private industry. So in fact, like this is the intellectual basis of sort of right-wing politics in America. So I think we can expect that what we saw in Project 2025, which is massive cuts to almost every government program, the sort of politicization of the bureaucracy, although I think the way that plays out can be a little tricky in terms of how liberals message it, but the increased politicization towards a more conservative vision, more pro-capitalist vision of the bureaucracy, that all these different things are going to happen, and that this will be done in conjunction with these massive, probably $3 trillion worth of tax cuts.
A lot of socialists watch our show, activists, organizers. People might be thinking Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, right-wing hawk, Hegseth, the new Secretary of Defense, a real wild, racist, right-wing militarist. Those are the things people kind of know about. They don't know, and this is what I want people to think about: the Office of Management and Budget. It seems bureaucratic. It seems like it's not the kind of thing that seems very exciting. So people don't pay attention to it. But this is very, very important. And I also want to bring out a historical fact is that when Ronald Reagan came into office in 1981, one of the goals was to basically roll back the civil rights movement, the economic social reforms that Black America had achieved that also benefited women and also benefited low-income white workers too. I mean, everybody, the whole working class really benefited from these things. But the bourgeoisie wanted to take that money back. They thought like, why are we giving money to poor people? It's our money. Just the way they're thinking now. This is our money. We want to take it back. That's the sort of the logic and the emotion that is motivating them. Well, in the Office of Management and Budget, at that time, Dave Stockman was the OMB. Nobody knew of him. He had been a congressperson. But they started ripping down all of the social and economic reforms of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, such that, the government said, your kids, low-income kids, had a right to go to school, get a free lunch if they didn't have money, and that lunch had to include 2 vegetables. What did Dave Stockman do? He categorized ketchup as the second vegetable. Does that seem like weird, greedy, cruel? Yes, it is. But that's what their thinking was. All of this money belongs to us, to the capitalists. These working class people shouldn't have it.
Yeah, no, I think that's the case. And look, I think when people think about the government, there's a reason why you don't really know how it runs, because honestly, many of the most powerful positions are ones that you don't hear that much about. OMB is a good example of that. Another good example of that is Elbridge Colby being named being nominated. I don't know if assistant secretaries of defense have to be nominated, but either way, being at least potentially put into place as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy. Now, that's something that you don't hear a lot about. Very important position. You just think about the name, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy. You're helping to develop the overall vision of how the U.S. military can and should be used. And Colby, for people who pay attention to national security, is one of the #1 advocates of war with China. Now, of course, he doesn't present it that way, but obviously it is. And he's a major advocate of a huge increase in militarism, U.S. military spending, all these different pieces. Very articulate in terms of how he puts it together. Very well respected, even by people who disagree with him because of how he puts that together. Pete Hegseth, I don't know if he's going to make it or if he's not going to make it. I'm not saying he's like some ignorant, dumb guy that can't read, but if you put someone like Colby in there, that means that you actually have someone who is a very cogent, let's go to war with China, let's massively increase the military in a critical position that you may not even hear about. And I think there's many different sort of points we can make. The Chief of Staff is another good example of that, right? Because they determine who comes in and who comes out. Even as we saw during the Nixon administration, you can see how secretaries actually can oftentimes end up playing huge roles in presidencies because they control the paper flow, what's on the president's desk. And if you can influence the person that gets something in front of the president's face when they have a lot of paper coming, you can influence a lot of policy. So I think I'm getting a little far afield, but I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that, the way the government works is designed to keep real power shrouded to some degree. Like most people don't know that every single department actually has an advisory board. And the advisory board tends to be made up of the big corporations that have the biggest interest in that department. And they're in a constant flow of communication with that department about what their policies and implementation of different policies should be. Now, you and I cannot pick up the phone and call the Secretary of Agriculture and say, hey, I'm a farmer in Iowa, and this is what I feel we should be doing. But Archer Daniels Midland can have someone directly inputted into the government to be discussing with them what they should be doing about seeds and this, that, and the third. So I think there's so many different areas where when we say big business really controls politics, we mainly think of it from the point of view of campaign donations, which is a huge one, but not from the point of view of the revolving door, which I actually view as somewhat more significant because you move up the income ladder by revolving in and out of the government. And anyone who's ever lived in DC, you know how it is. You work in the government, you go to the private sector. You go back, but you keep going up in that way. And you insert these people in these positions because then they're able to use those roles, many of them more powerful than they look, to sort of push these agendas in ways that aren't going to be as much on Front Street as what's happening in Congress or what's happening at the cabinet level.
Yeah, and we can learn to hate politicians, whether it's Biden or Trump. They come and go. But this is the state. Lenin, in his book, State and Revolution, one of his premier, most important books that everyone should read and study, he talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning what he envisions if there's a socialist revolution, and then there was one in old Russia. But he's saying it's a dictatorship of the proletariat as opposed to the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And what you're describing is a system of class dictatorship. Those individuals who we learn to hate, the politicians, they're the front men. But behind the front men, in the chambers that we don't see, we don't know about, we don't know basically how it functions unless you really seriously study it. That's the permanent government. Now, Trump says there's the deep state. Well, there is the state. It's a permanent state. It represents the interests of capital. And in fact, that's what exists. Now, going on, because I know time is short, the one section of the capitalist class absolutely depends on immigrant labor. A big part of it, and I would say the entire capitalist economy depends on immigrant labor in many, many, many areas. You go to the poultry factories in the South or the hog factories. There was Smithfield plant that was organized successfully. They kill 32,000 hogs a day. They're all people from Latin America. They might be here with legal papers. They might be here in an undocumented way. Immigrants are really running a big part of the economy, not just in food processing, also in construction, in several different areas. Trump says that we're going to deport 11 million, 12 million. It's performative in one sense because that was his big campaign. He was making native-born Americans hate foreign-born people. That was the goal. Blame them. What do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. And just one real quick point since you raised it. When we think about regulations and things people don't hear about, one people should watch is around meatpacking. When Trump was the president the last time, he basically changed the rules to make the line speeds, like when you come along and you're cutting them up, essentially as unlimited speed, which means that many more people are going to lose fingers, hands, arms, and be grievously injured. Now, one of the good things the Biden administration did is they sort of pumped the brakes on that. I think that is an important area for people to watch when we think about workers' rights in America. Are they going to increase the line speeds? Like when you bite into a hamburger, eat a ham sandwich, have a spicy chicken sandwich, like, are the people who are making that possible for you going to be like significantly more likely to lose an arm because of government policy? We're thinking about, I think, for the average American. But I think in terms of immigration, what's going to happen is that they are going to push sort of as hard and fast as they can. I think the sort of 12 to 15 million seems fantastical to me, quite frankly. I mean,
for deportation.
I mean, 50% of the construction industry in Texas is estimated to be undocumented. And if you go to Texas, where the economy is definitely growing, they're building a lot of stuff in Texas. So it seems sort of shocking to me to think that the tech world, the oil barons, all these other people are going to want to see all their buildings like stall out before they're finished. You know what I mean? But I think when we look at immigration policy, we have to also put it in its correct context. That immigration policy, like when you look at all these visas, almost all of them are carve-outs for particular industries because immigration controls are a form of labor control. And it is very beneficial for the capitalist class to have many people more scared about speaking out about wages and working conditions on the job because they're worried about their immigration status. It means you create a larger pool of people who you can pay significantly less. So by having this wave of fear, by the way, this happened during the 1930s under FDR too, having this wave of fear around deportations, they will undoubtedly deport many people, but they also will drive many more people further into the shadows and deeper into fear, which means they will accept, not just worse wages and working conditions, also worse housing. I mean, you look at some of the most substandard housing in our urban areas. You look at when you have these disasters like basements flooding that were illegally subdivided in New York City and things like that. The impact of that oftentimes falls very heavily on undocumented people because what are you going to say to your landlord? Because they can just call ICE on you if they know that you're undocumented, right? So not only do you have like businesses in and of themselves, like the way we think, factories and different things, but I think you have landlords. I think you have many people who will benefit from having a larger subset of people who won't speak up about things not being right because this is their only chance really to make it and survive. That's why they're coming here in the first place. So I think that what Trump is saying when you sort of read between the lines, they're saying they're going to start with criminals. I don't know what that means. And I think people should be very wary of that. The way they message it is like rapists and murderers. But the reality is, There are, people who are on ICE detainers who had like a drunk driving, 2 or 3 tickets or something like that. But I think that is where they will start, is with people who are already in U.S. prisons and jails that have ICE detainers on them, that they can then say these people are criminals and they'll kick them out. I think they'll look for sort of some of the more undesirable, and I don't mean the people are undesirable, but people they can present as more undesirable, right? Like, Haitians or whatever, the Venezuelans, because they're all gang members. Like, they're going to look for populations like that that'll be easy to message. And I think they're going to attempt to try to get 1-2 million people, like a large number in 1 year, so that they can then kind of put a bow on it. But I think the U.S. economy, I know, would tank if 12 to 15 million undocumented people were out of the workforce. And I think this is, in a way, and I'll close on this here, maybe the most important thing for American workers to realize is the first point I made about why it's beneficial to have undocumented people in the country, or people who, even if they're documented, are on these H-2A, H-1B type visas where they have lesser rights. That is reducing your wages. Everyone says the immigrants are reducing your wages, but what's actually reducing your wages is you can't create labor solidarity across the working class. And you could deport every single person, and I feel very confident that bosses in America would not increase wages. In fact, they would do everything they possibly could to decrease wages. You look at people talk about the 1920s and the immigration restrictionist era that began in 1924. Well, don't believe me, Eugene Puryear, just go back and look at the history books. In the 1920s, were they drastically improving people's wages? No, they weren't drastically improving people's wages. 1930s? No, they weren't drastically increasing people's wages until they started organizing unions. So you're told that the immigrant is your enemy. But in fact, the immigrant worker, if they had legal status and could actually speak out, would make it easier to organize on the job to confront your boss to get higher wages and better working conditions. As long as you have different subsets of the working class divided, where someone says, you know what, I feel like we should go on strike, but I can't be worried about this because immigration. You know what, I feel like we should go on strike, but I'm a woman and women don't get jobs as much. I feel like we should go on strike, but hey, black people, we don't get paid that much money around here, and this is kind of better than other things. As long as you have these little divisions to divide people, you cannot advance. That's why unions increase people's wages and working conditions better than anything else, because that's when all workers come together to generate the maximum amount of pressure on the person who controls the wages and working conditions. So from my point of view, even though to many people it seems counterintuitive because they feel like they're competing with immigrants, if you really want to increase your wages, your pensions, your working conditions, and your health care, you actually need more rights for immigrants, because you have to create more solidarity on the job, which allows you to create a united front to fight back against the boss. If they can divide you up, your wages are going to be lower than they could be if you were all united. It's basic when you think about it like that, but there's so much propaganda that's out there that's designed to use our differences to make us hate each other, rather than recognize that when it comes to our core living standard, our commonality is more important.
And for socialists, we have to make this a priority. I heard even in the apartment building here in New York, where, working class people who are against Trump said, well, I disagree with Trump about everything, but he's got a good point about illegals, aliens, or undocumented people, or whatever. This is the permeating into the working class of bourgeois class collaborationist consciousness, because that's what it means. What you're talking about is if you're native born or you're a citizen, you identify the immigrant as your sister, brother, fellow class member who has a similar fight with you. If you're white, you have to reject the anti-black racism. When you go down the misogyny, the attacks against trans people and gay people, all of these things are designed to divide us as a class. And if we say, well, I'm not an immigrant, so I'm going to step aside, well, you're actually not only hurting that immigrant, you're not only doing a great disservice, you're doing a disservice to yourself, to your family, to the working class. You're playing into the hands of your class enemy, the capitalists. And this is really what class consciousness, I think, means right now. I want to talk, as we now move towards the finish line, Eugene, go back to Biden and the Democrats. Biden has done some ridiculous things going out to preserve his legacy, like he commuted the sentences of 30 people who were going to be possibly sentenced to death because they were convicted of murder or something like that. I don't know if that would have been wildly popular with masses of people, but whatever, he was doing something. He also, maybe more significantly, announced an executive order permanently banning offshore drilling in 625 million acres in the ocean, making a Trump reversal actually more difficult because it has to be reversed by Congress. Now, I looked at what the oil and natural gas industry said about this, not moratorium, actual cancellation of projected future offshore drilling, meaning in the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic Ocean, Pacific. They were like, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Because oil production is higher under Biden than it was under any previous administration. There's so many oil rigs already in the Gulf of Mexico, so future projected construction of new oil rigs is not necessary. So it's completely symbolic, completely meaningless. Now, I want to play one last clip. This again, I'm making the point that Biden's anti-Trump stuff is kind of BS, basically. It's performative, it's not real. But then I want to play this clip from Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, talking about why he thought Trump did the right thing about China, but how the Biden administration was even more right because they were even better at going to war, economic war, and perhaps later military war with China. Let's listen.
Let's talk about China for a minute. I think President Trump was right during his first administration in identifying some of the challenges posed by China. And where I would commend to him the approach that we pursued is we're so much more effective in dealing with the challenges posed by China when we're working closely with other countries. When we took office, the European Union was on the verge of signing a major trade agreement, and they were hedging toward China. So were many other countries. We were really on the decline when it came dealing with China diplomatically and economically. We've reversed that.
Blinken is such a despicable little imperialist. Anyway, I won't be that sad to see him go as Secretary of State, although, as you said, he will undoubtedly now rotate into some $1 million plus per year position in some law firm. But his point is that Trump did the right thing about China, but because he didn't bring the allies with them, he wasn't as successful as Blinken. I want to go out with this point. We're building an opposition movement to Trump's billionaire agenda. We, meaning a broad coalition of people. There's going to be real important demonstrations January 20th, the day Trump takes office. But people should not think of the Democrats as some sort of lesser evil even than Trump, because what he's basically saying is we're more effective as imperialists than Trump. His criticism of Trump is not for taking the world to the brink of war with China, but not doing it effectively enough. The Democrats not only are not a solution, they are the problem, along with the Republicans. These are the two ruling class parties. We are not fighting against politicians or even the Democratic Party or Republican Party. We are fighting against the capitalist system that they represent, which is in fact bringing the world to the edge of multiple crises. Again, the need for an independent movement.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's critically important. And I mean, people have to think about this as a billionaire agenda. I mean, we're going to see what happens with the tax cuts, but some modeling is saying there that the tax cuts they're proposing, if they were able to do it all, it'd be about $3 trillion less in government revenue. And that's a lot of money. That means that a lot of programs that are going to help people are going to be cut. And it also means, by the way, that the chief sort of motivator is they say it's going to trickle down. That will, yes, it'll be $3 trillion less revenue in the government, but it'll all be made up because there's going to be big economic gains. That's not going to happen. You're just going to lose $3 trillion. Long-run GDP increase by this modeling I'm looking at, this is from the Tax Foundation, so not like a progressive group, 0.8%. Long-run wages, 0.8% increase. Long-run jobs, just under 600,000. So that's not an economic boom. But if you think about the first Trump tax cuts, now the average sort of middle fifth of the economy, right? Like the middle, right in the middle of income in America, based on the Trump tax cuts, got about $910 in tax relief. The top 0.1%, $252,000. When you look at just the corporate element of it, 80% of all of the gains from the corporate tax cuts of Trump's economic tax cuts in 2017 went to the top 10% of incomes. 80%. So 20% went to 90% of people. So you can see this is a billionaire agenda. There's not going to be any economic boom. They're going to massively have to slash the government of the programs that you like. Like, don't think they're going to cut things that they like. They're going to cut the things that people like, that people think help them. And on top of that, we already have the evidence that the vast majority of the gains that are going to come from this are going to go to the top 10% of the economy, really the top 1%. And really the top 0.1% of the economy is who's gonna benefit from these policies. Like, that's the billionaire agenda, and that's the evidence of it, and that's why we ultimately need to have an independent movement, as you say, because the Democrats are not actually fundamentally changing this. I mean, I wrote about this a lot at liberationnews.org during the campaign. I mean, Kamala Harris's entire pitch to corporate America is, I'm actually gonna be more pro-corporate than Biden. And this is Biden who told the big donors, listen, don't worry about what I'm saying on the campaign trail. For you, nothing will fundamentally change. So she was going to be more pro-corporate than the guy who said nothing will fundamentally change for all of the corporate bosses. Or then you look at Chuck Schumer, who's going to be leading the Democrats in the Senate, who said, we've done enough for working class people. We didn't just message it right. I mean, if you don't understand why that's ridiculous, then we have to, you're already lost in many different ways. And I think just look at your own bank account and you'll understand how ridiculous that is. I mean, we could go on and on and on in this regard, but you can see, even though the Democrats are different in many ways, sometimes in ways that are actually important, they are not actually changing the trajectory of where society is headed. They're not changing the trajectory of the fact, like when you look since 1998 at the amount of money that is raised from corporate taxes, it's basically the same from 1998 to now. When you look at corporate profits, it's just going up and 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 up. And in fact, the gap is becoming larger and larger and larger. So whether it's Democrats or whether it's Republicans, the rich are getting richer. The government is basically stagnating, if not declining, in its ability to provide services to us, which we see with everything collapsing around us. And people's basic living standard is at best stagnating. And I think for the vast majority of people is getting at least somewhat to not significantly worse as costs are increasing in every possible way, and they're finding it harder and harder to keep up. So it doesn't matter what party, that trajectory is not changing. So if you ask yourself, are the Democrats and Republicans different? Yes. And the Democrats, for progressive people, working class people, they prey on you because they say, well, look how openly racist they are. We're a little bit more for unions. And all those things are true. But what they don't say is, but what's the actual problem? And what are the solutions that are going to meet the scale of the problem? Because when you have a problem, you want to solve the problem. You know what I mean? Like if you're broke, you're trying to figure out how to get more money. If you have a leak, you're trying to figure out how to plug the leak. So when you look at the Democrats, they're saying, okay, yeah, there is a problem, but we're never going to propose a solution that meets the scale of the problem, which means the problem only gets worse and the trajectory for you only gets worse. So the only way to change that is to propose, demand, and fight for solutions that meet the scale of the problems that are facing us, and that is only going to happen outside of the two-party system. If you're working class, whether you voted for Harris or Trump, both of them are trying to fool you, and both of them are not going to actually change the trajectory of your life in a more positive direction. So whatever else you might think about the other workers who voted for Trump or voted for Harris, we got to find a way to bring people together as much as we possibly can, because only that independent working class center that has working class and oppressed interests at the core can start to now bend that trajectory in the other way. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, but you have to bend it. It isn't natural. And if we're going to bend the arc towards justice in his dream, and here we are just coming up on the King holiday, I think we have to recognize that neither of the two parties are going to get it done for us.
All right, Eugene, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.